Well, true confession time. The family, me and Lyra and Shay and Bryn went to Omaha this week. We left Monday and came back Friday. It was great to get away, to kind of unplug. We got to see the zoo. We went to a ropes course, which I'm still recovering from. Actually jammed these two fingers, Jim, which is why when you squeezed my hand earlier, I was like, you're fine. I love you too. But all that being said, we drove back on Friday, and I spent the day here yesterday, and my notes are going to be very limited. That's your confession. So we're going to get through this together. I was, like I said, going through Acts. I've been kind of reading through Acts, and I ran across this thing, and this is really, I'm not normally, I'll like preach on a passage, and I'll tell you this and this and this. This is what's in the passage. What happened, and this might even lead to a series, so you can ask me if that's true next week or not. We will find out. But I'll tell you what happened in my mind as I was reading. It's one of the first times that we see the word Christian. We talked about Antioch last week or week before. The church in Antioch was actually the first place they ever used the word Christian. It was about 20 years after Jesus died and rose again that we first see that word. But here we'll see an instance of it that sparked my mind. Let me tell you what's happening, and I'm just going to read a few verses from Acts chapter 26, okay? I'm going to be started reading at 24. But if I don't give you a little bit of background, it's going to feel like way out of context. So what's happening in this passage is Paul has been arrested because he's preaching the gospel. He's telling people Jesus is the answer. And people don't like that. As a matter of fact, the word Christian is sometimes been translated as little Christ. But at the time, actually a better definition, a better translation of that word, maybe for us, is party of Christ. Because, and I mean that the way we think of Pharisees, Sadducees, all these other names you might have heard that run around the time, they were all different parties. They were parties, political parties that tried to influence the government, the state of Rome, according to their own desires. That's what they functioned as. And they had a little bit different belief systems, every one of them. And Christian shows up on the scene, and the reason it's a problem is because it's political. I've said this before. That's the reason Christianity becomes a problem. Because when, you probably read this if you've read much of the New Testament, repeatedly, they say, the disciples say, one of the phrases they say, they repeat it over and over and over again. They say, Jesus is Lord. That's a common Christian phrase. Jesus is Lord. Now, in ancient Rome, you could get away with anything. Your religion didn't matter. You could light candles and say prayers to any number of deities, and they were all fine. Nobody was going to have a problem with it. So long as you agreed on one thing. Caesar is Lord. And because of that, Christianity begins to become a problem. Because they won't say Caesar is Lord. They say Jesus is Lord. And this is part of the reason that Paul has been imprisoned and he's arrested and he's on his way to Rome to go and make his case before Caesar. Eventually he would die in Rome. He'd be killed there. But along the way, he is with a guy named Festus, who is a Roman leader, kind of underling, and a guy named Agrippa shows up. Agrippa is Herod. You know Herod. We've talked about Herod. There's so many Herods. You have to look at a family tree every time you talk about one, because there's Herods all over. But they're all related. This is the grandson, I believe, or great-grandson of the Herod who you might read about Jesus. Pontius Pilate said, send him to Herod. I don't want... This guy comes later in the lineage. But he is a vassal, a puppet king. Let's think of it that way. That's what Herod serves as. He's Jewish. Herod Agrippa is Jewish, at least ethnically. Culturally, there's some issues. But he knows the Jewish histories. He knows the background. And he pretty much has to just be a yes man to the Roman government. That's the way it sort of works. They let him kind of have his throne, but they tell him what to do. That's essentially the system. So Paul's with Festus, and Festus is like, hey, Agrippa, come over here. I want you to hear from Paul. Then Paul comes and he kind of defends himself and explains the gospel and talks about Jesus rising from the dead. And then this is what we read, starting in chapter 26, verse 24. As he was saying these things, Paul, as he was saying these things in his defense, Festus said with a loud voice, Paul, you're out of your mind. Your great learning is driving you out of your mind. But Paul said, I'm not out of my mind, most excellent Festus, but I'm speaking true and rational words. The king, meaning Agrippa, the king knows about these things, and to him I speak boldly, for I am persuaded that none of these things has escaped his notice. For this has not been done in a corner. Let me just pause right there. Because it is common for us to miss this. And this is not really related, but it's something I have to absolutely point out to you. Paul just said in a public space, in like a court of law, with two main political leaders standing there and lots of other people in the room, this has not happened in a corner. And he's talking about the resurrection of Jesus. Sometimes it's something that I hear people say, well, it's a great story, but here we are 2,000 years removed from it. A lot has been added. You don't know. I just want to point out that within 35, maybe 40 years of Jesus' death and resurrection, Paul is standing in a crowded place saying, I know the king knows about this because it's been everywhere. Jesus rose, and everybody's been talking about it. It's not something that happened in some corner. I know he knows about it. That's what Paul says, and he has the confidence to be able to say that. Then he says, verse 27, King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know that you believe. And Agrippa said to Paul, in a short time, would you persuade me to be a Christian? It's one of the first times we see the word. In a short time, would you just persuade me to be a Christian? So here's what, let me share with you what happened in my head as I'm reading. What would that look like? What does that look like? How do we know? Really, I mean, it's a question that I think has been wrestled with for thousands of years. How do we know if someone's a Christian? What does it look like if Agrippa says yes and is persuaded to become a Christian? What does a Christian look like? What are some of the main features that we could expect to find in the life of a Christian, a person who's a disciple, a follower? There's a different language we use, right? What would that look like? Now, I can't give you a complete list, okay? I can't tell you everything. Not in certainly one sermon, probably not in a series. I might tackle that, begin to talk about that a little bit just for the next few weeks. But just a few things that pop out. The first is, it's right here, believe. Paul says to Agrippa, I know you believe the prophets. Now, what he's getting at is that a Christian believes that Jesus is the answer, the thing that the prophets were pointing toward, the thing, the hope, the longing. Like, Agrippa's a Jew. He knows the stories. His grandpa met Jesus and sent him, in part, had something to do with him going to the cross. He knows the stories. He knows that ultimately the Jewish nation, the people, are looking for a king who will establish his rule and protect and defend his people. That is their longing. And Paul is like, a Christian here, in this case, will believe that Jesus is the answer to that question, to that problem. Now, as I thought about this, I think sometimes we don't define the problem well. Like, the problem for them in their era, right, was that a king, defend, protect, right? That's the problem. We talk about sin and forgiveness, valid points, right? But I'm not sure we've got it nailed down well, because I know a lot of people who attend church sometimes for years, and who, if you say, do you believe that Jesus is the answer to the problem, they can recite for you the Apostles' Creed. I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, right? Jesus Christ, His only begotten Son, our Lord, conceived by the Holy Spirit, born of the Virgin Mary, crucified, died under Pontius Pilate. We can say it. We know it. And our hope is often in what we believe. Now, that's an important phrase. I'm going to say it again. Our hope as Christians, as people who attend church, our hope can often be in what we believe to be true. I'll tell you an example I've heard before. Go to Grand Canyon, which is like, been to the Grand Canyon? Who's been to the Grand Canyon? Who's seen it in person? Okay, enough of you. It's big, it's massive, it's deep, it's awe-inspiring, really, to stand and look at. You go there and you see a tightrope stretched across, right, from one side to the other, which is a good haul, by the way. And you see a guy walking back and forth on the tightrope, pushing a wheelbarrow. Of course, the crowd gathers around. And they're like, wow, that's amazing. And they're watching him go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And then he rolls right up to you and he says, hey, you believe that I can push this wheelbarrow across there? You're like, sure I do. I just saw you do it. And he says, get in. That's faith. Right? That's what faith is. That the only hope, the only answer is actually getting in the wheelbarrow. You can believe all day long that He'll push that thing over to the other side, but until you get in it, you're not getting there. You got to get in, curl up, and pray hard. Because that's the only way to get across. You know, and then I thought about, well, what it means to be human and to live in this world. And we had this conversation in the car on the way back about the reality that every single one of us knows in our hearts to be true. And that is that things sometimes just don't go the way they ought to. People hurt. We hurt, life hurts, even when no one does anything wrong at all. You get cancer. I mean, something happens. Life is hard. And the question comes up, well, in those times, right, we say we believe in a God who's all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving. Why does that happen? Why didn't He do something about it? Why didn't He stop that or prevent that or cause this? Where was God? Now, if you've not had that moment yet of being in the valley and wondering where God is, I would do, well, first of all, I'd encourage you to look a little harder, because you probably have. A lot of times when we're walking through that valley of the shadow of death, we don't like to admit it. There's a long history in Western Christendom, I suppose, of, putting on a happy face, pretending away reality, because that's too ugly. Because then we have to wrestle with the question, right? Where is God? Some of us don't like to wrestle with questions like that, and so we pretend. So I'd encourage you to look harder and find that place where you see your own story and you go, God, where were you when that happened? And go ahead and ask the question. It's a fair question, and God can handle it. In fact, I think it's important to ask it. But as this conversation comes up, and this is why I think faith is so important, here's what I said, or wrestled or struggled to somehow come to, because I think it's the only answer. When we are wandering in the valley, and many of us have done this, many of us have been in the valley, I know. But when we ask that question, God, where were you, or where are you in this moment, in this hard thing, in this tragedy? Where are you? We have three options that I can see. Only three. The first is, this is all just an accident and there is no God. Because he can't be all good, all loving, and all knowing and let this happen. He's just not there, right? Now, to be fair, I think that takes almost as much faith. Almost as much faith to believe that we are all accidentally here and there's no meaning. Like when you look at creation, with to have happened accidentally is just too much for me to believe. I don't have that kind of faith. I can't fathom that. But that's one option. There is no God. Option two, there is, and he is pulling his hair out and scratching his head and thinking, oh no, how did it come to this? I wish I could do something about that. That's option two. Option three is he's sitting there and he says, I know, and I hurt with you, but I promise to bring beauty and redemption and life out of this tragedy. And that takes faith. It takes faith too. You know, you can't have faith if you have certainty. You can't. You cannot have faith if you're certain. Faith means belief in spite of. It means holding on to a hope that sometimes feels like a challenge. That faith is a part of what it means to be a Christian. To hold on to hope, even when it feels foolish. To somehow find a way, as we're walking in the valley of the shadow of death, to believe the words of the psalmist. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. You will be there. And even sometimes, I can look back and I can see previous difficult things that, Lyra brought up this, I forget what it's called, Japanese art of broken pottery, where you break a vase or a jar and then you heal it, you put it back together with gold along the places where it was broken. And it comes out more beautiful and far more stronger. And there are times in my life when I look back where I can see that God has done something like that with my pain. He's made things more beautiful. He's made me stronger because of that. But here's the reality. I know this is true. There are times that we go through struggles and suffering, and we may go to the grave before we know what kind of beauty God's going to bring out of that. But I still believe and have faith that even through the generations, there is something happening that his view is larger than mine. And I think we have to hope and we have to long for that. That is the kind of faith that a Christian is marked with. The kind of faith that gets in the wheelbarrow. That doesn't merely say, I believe this and I believe that and I believe this, but actually gets in the wheelbarrow. In hard times, in good times, in wealthy times and in poor times. That we get in the wheelbarrow and we say, my only hope is in Jesus. He's it. He's the only answer. Not the fact that I believe this about him. That is zero hope. You will go to hell believing the truth about Jesus. James tells us even the demons believe. And he asks us, will you get in the wheelbarrow? Will you trust him? And not your money, your security, your reputation, your fame, your whatever idols that we tend to trust. That's the first thing that marks us, I think, is real, that kind of hard, dirty, nasty, grimy faith. The second thing that I think marks a Christian that popped out to me when I thought about it is love. John 13, right before Jesus dies, he tells his followers, he says, by this, all people will know that you are my disciples. By this one thing, everybody out there will know that you're my disciples. We suppose he said, we know, some of you know. He didn't say how you vote. He didn't say, whether you smoke or drink or chew or whatever. He didn't say any of those things that we so often. He didn't say if you show up at church on Christmas Eve or on Sundays or every time the doors are. He didn't say any of that. By this, they will know you're my disciples if you love one another. That's it. That's the one thing that he says people will know that you're my disciples. Francis Schaeffer said, the mark of the Christian is love. Now, when I see this, I see it kind of going two ways. The first is right there what Jesus said, you love one another. Brothers and sisters, fellow Christians, you love one another. Whew. I mean, it's relatively easy right here. It is, because we're kind of on the same page about most things. It's pretty easy to love one another right here. Usually, sometimes we get a little more right than the other one. I'm guilty, because I know all the right answers. They didn't even laugh. We all kind of feel like we know best, right? And so when we disagree, it can be a little harder to love each other because we love what? Our opinion just a little more than one another. And I don't just mean here. What made me struggle the most when I read this, they will know your disciples by your love for one another. I'll tell you what I thought. In all authenticity and honesty, I thought of one particular person on TV who identifies as a Christian and who I tend to warn people who I love not to listen to. His name is Joel Osteen. And I often feel like, and this is the trick, this is the hard thing within Christendom, is that sometimes there are teachers and preachers and things out there that are harmful. I've done things that are harmful. I've said things probably right here that are harmful. I have. We've all done that. And so when my duty is to help sort of shepherd, and I have to say that's not the best source of teaching. But that doesn't mean I get to not love. And that's a fine line to walk, right? Where we're honest. We say that's a challenge. Here's some things I see about that. But it can feel really good to take some pot shots and share some memes, right? It can feel good, and that's not love. And Jesus says, and I'm guilty. I have shared some memes. And I'll probably not done. We'll see. But is that love? This is things that we need to work on. Jesus says, they will know you're my disciples by your love, not by how right you are. And that's something hard for me. Love one another. But the other thing I think that comes out too is the world. You know, it says, John 3, you'll know this verse because they hang it, it's a football verse. God so loved the world that he sent his only son. The whole world. We're called to be, one of the translations of Christian is little Christ, right? We're called to be like him. He loved the world so much that he laid down his life. Man, that's hard. When I thought of this, I thought, what would that look like for us? Because here's the challenge, and this is what I hear, and I get it. I totally get it. And many people have told me this, and I 100% agree with them, that to love someone, you got to tell them the truth. I mean, if you love somebody, what's his name? Penn and Teller, the Penn guy, or maybe it was the Teller guy. One of those two had a viral video a while back where he talked about Christians who don't share the gospel. And he said, how much do you have to hate somebody if you believe that they are going to hell tonight? He doesn't believe, but he said, if you don't share that, how much do you have to hate somebody not to share that? And I agree. That's not love. We have to tell the truth if we are to love. But then here's what I thought of. A lot of times when I hear that, when people say, well, it's not loving not to tell the truth. I don't know the sources, the times when I've heard that. This is what I feel like is being said. My neighbor, and I don't necessarily mean my neighbor, that might apply. The person lives beside you, but Jesus says love your neighbor, so I'm using that broadly. My neighbor is annoying me with their choices, with their lifestyles, with their belief systems, and they need to be corrected so that I'm more comfortable. And it's not loving to just let them get away with it. And the question is, who are we really loving in that? See, here's the thing. Whether you believe or not, right? Jesus is who he said he was. Whether you believe or not that Jesus actually rose from the dead, the world, there is nobody. I have never heard this argument. I've heard a lot of arguments. This is an argument I've never, ever, ever heard. The story goes that he gave his life for the world. That's not very loving. Never, whatever you believe, I've never heard anybody say that's not loving. Now, when you go to your neighbor and you say, here's the truth that you need to hear, I want you to ask them, do you feel loved? The world needed Jesus. They might feel corrected. Sometimes the world's like, I don't need Jesus, and I don't like that. Somebody thinks they need to give. You cannot like it, but it feels loving. You can be a little too proud to change. You can be a little arrogant. You can be right. But you can't say, well, that was harsh. But oftentimes when we go in love and tell the truth to our neighbor, it doesn't really feel like love. It cost Jesus everything to love the world. Everything. What does it cost us to love the world? Because if it doesn't cost us something, they're not going to feel loved. And love, as Francis Schaeffer said, is the mark of the Christian. That's what it is. It's love. Whatever we may believe is right, and whatever things we think we need to tell people, whatever we think they need to hear, they need to feel loved. That's what Christianity demands. That's what following Jesus is. Really quick, the final thing that stood out to me when I thought this, I'm like, well, what else does it look like? What does it really look like? And again, I can't be comprehensive. I can't tell you everything. But I think faith, and love, and then I thought, hope. We kind of already covered that because our hope comes out of our faith. Well, the thing that popped into my head was a popular verse. Many of us probably heard it. It's from the book of Micah in the Old Testament, where he says, what does God require? I mean, that's a pretty solid place to go to look for what does it look like to be a follower of God. You look at what God requires, and it says, do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God. That's what God requires. Justice, to do what is right. Justice in the biblical sense is to uplift the downtrodden, to do what we can to help those who are not as fortunate as others. That's justice. Do justice. Love kindness. I mean, oh, God help us. There's another election coming. I'm so disheartened by this fact because I hate election time. Because people who identify as Christians are going to turn on their caps lock and they're going to go blasting snowflakes or repubtards or whatever these words are that people call each other. And it just gets so nasty. And we are called to love kindness. Love kindness. That's not loving kindness. Turn off your caps locks, delete your Facebook account if you've got to. And be kind. Because ultimately it doesn't matter. It doesn't. None of that matters. It really doesn't. Because Jesus sits on the throne of the universe. And I know some of this is a struggle. To believe that. Man, that's hard. And I've heard this before. I'm just going to, see, I told you, this is what happens when I don't have good notes. I just start rambling. All right. I've heard this when people talk about these things, and I know there's somebody here, I know it, who's like, Jesus had some really good things to say, but come on, he stayed in the grave. But I just pointed out that Paul's like, just 35 years later, he's like, dude, you know about this. You know the grave was empty. You know it. Right? That's part of that argument. And 2,000 years later, it's easy to be like, nah. Right? But he said some really good things, and I just have to share with you one of my favorite teachers, and some of you probably heard this, C.S. Lewis. He said, and he says it better than I can, but he says, Jesus won't have any of this nonsense about being called a good moral teacher. Because Jesus said he was God. The reason they put Jesus to death, the reason he died on the cross is because he said he was God. Now that's a leap. That's faith. Real Christian, right? We talked about that. Christian has faith. It takes a leap of faith to believe that Jesus was God and rose from the dead. I get that. But this is what Lewis says. If you think he's some kind of good moral teacher, you should know this. He's either a liar from the pit of hell, these are Lewis's words, or a lunatic on the level of a man who calls himself a poached egg, again, Lewis, or he's the Lord of the universe. He won't have any of this nonsense about being a good moral teacher. So when we approach Jesus, we have a couple of options. We can say, crazy man, evil man, or Lord. And I think when we enter into that, when we see him for who he is, and we begin to believe that he rose from the dead, it shifts our hope. And as our hope shifts, our love shifts, right? Because a Christian has this love. What do we love the most? Love actually causes most of the pain in the universe. Love. It's just love of self, love of stuff, love of idols, love of comfort, love of a whole long list of things that will ultimately destroy our lives, right? Love of drugs. A lot of people love drugs. Doesn't go well. Promise. Right? Love causes that. But as we find our hope in Jesus, as we go, oh, the real answer is to get my butt in the wheelbarrow and stop trying to find all these things on my own, then our love shifts. As our love points up to Him, it changes the way we act out toward others. And then we can be humble and walk humbly with our God. I think that's the start, just the start of what it looks like to call ourselves a Christian. It's my hope that over the next months together, we will begin to find out a little more what it could look like if we were more and more and more focused on Jesus. Let me pray for us. Jesus, would you just be more to us? More than all the stuff and all the other things that we tend to think will satisfy us or make us happy or somehow come to meet our needs. Would you, if you have to, break our knuckles from holding on to those things too tight and help us to see that as a mercy. Be with us. Help us to trust in you. Help us to believe in you. To have a strong, deep faith that you actually can do what you say. And help us to love you, to love one another, and to love our world a little bit better. It's in your name we pray, Jesus. Amen.